Okay, I'll kick us off. Just a few housekeeping items before we dive into the conversation. You'll notice the screen says that for our attendees, your camera is off, your mic is muted. We would love for you to ask questions in the chat or in the Q&A. Both will be open throughout the duration of the conversation. Jen Leveson, as facilitator of the conversation, will do my best to kind of manage the conversation going on in the chat and Q&A, but rest assured, if we don't address your questions during the conversation, we will get to those at the end. And then also, if we run out of time in that regard, we will also send out some follow-up messages. So I'm going to get us started. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will turn my camera on. And I would love for my panelists to do that as well. So Susan, Ben, and Eric, if you can cameras on and unmute. Thank you so much. So hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jen Leveson. I am Director of Content and Editor-in-Chief here at Mortar. We are a search engine for the commercial construction and design industry. And in my role, I have the pleasure of telling the stories of the industry. And so I was so grateful that Lindsay was letting me share her duties of webinar facilitating and hosting today so that I could talk with our panelists today on a topic that's really near and dear to our hearts here at Mortar, and I know across the industry as well, talking about sustainability, material transparency, and looking at the education sector so that we can see how our industry's work really impacts the generation and the population that's leaning on us and turning to us to get it right. So very excited to have all of you here today. And I will let them do their own introductions, but quickly, I am joined by Susan Klaus at GMI Companies, Ben Oberle at 3M, and then Eric Corey-Fried at Canon Design. Thanks all so much for today. Susan, why don't you kick off introductions?
Sure. Hi, I'm Susan Klaus. I am the Director of Marketing here at GMI Companies, and you might be familiar with one of our brands, as that's our parent company, Gent Waddell and Vivid Board. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation, as sustainability and making cleaner, safer choices is something that is personally near and dear to my heart, but I think we're doing some really interesting things here that I'm excited to be able to share with you.
Awesome. Thank you. Ben, why don't you go next?
Good afternoon. I'm Ben Oberle. I'm the Segment Marketing Manager for 3M's Commercial Solutions Division. So many of you probably know 3M from Post-it or from Scotch or some of the different consumer-based products. 3M's got quite a few different products in different industries, and education is one that we do quite a bit of focus on. So similar to what Susan said, we're looking at, how do we sustainably deliver solutions into education, and really how do we keep students and their families safe? As we look at the education market, what really concerns us is, there's so much going on, and just students learning is one big process, but how do we keep them safe in doing that? So I'm excited to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome, thank you. And last but not least, Eric Corey-Fried.
Hi, everybody. My name is Eric. I'm an architect and I'm Director of Sustainability at Canon Design. We're a top 10 architecture firm and also the #2 most innovative company in North America, oddly enough. And we bring this innovation approach to sustainability by really focusing on outcomes, which I'm sure I'll talk about later today. But thank you for having me.
No, thank you all very much. And we do have a fourth panelist that should hopefully be joining us during the conversation. Eric Malmstrom, he's CEO of Safe Traces, and they provide air quality services to the industry. So hopefully he'll be able to join us, but we are going to get started. It is such a great topic to dive into. So I'd like to start kind of broad and then dial in the conversation a little bit. But Eric, could you talk a little bit about the impact that design, that A&D has on educational spaces?
Well, there's multiple impacts. The first one is, if we go from the macro, it's just the impact that buildings have on the environment, right? Half of our carbon emissions come from the design, operation, and construction of buildings. So if we're going to solve the climate crisis, we have to change how we design and build our buildings. That's the big one. But I think your question probably is hinting more at the quality of the spaces. And what we've seen is that if we do our job properly for an educational space, we can boost student test scores, we can boost cognitive performance, we can make them feel at ease, we can have stress reduction, we can improve staff retention rates. All of these are measurable, quantifiable outcomes that we can design towards in sustainability. And instead, I feel like the last 30 years has been an argument in, proving our worth. We get bogged down in return on investment and payback and all these other financial issues when there are so many more bigger, impactful things that we can design towards. And this is kind of that outcomes-based approach I was talking about, right? We show a lot of these different outcomes to our clients and say, what are these things worth to you, right? And then we design the building toward them. And by building them in at the start like that, they don't get value engineered out. They're woven into the DNA of the design in the building, and it's a rather effective way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that it's easiest to start at that place, or are you able through remodels and retrofits to be able to have that conversation even in a current space, looking for upgrades and different things like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a heck of a lot more existing buildings to deal with than there are new buildings that we build. So I'd much rather focus on transforming existing spaces. You're obviously limited by what they previously built, but I wrote a book some years ago on called Sustainable School Architecture. It was on green schools, and we must have interviewed hundreds of teachers and school administrators. And the most fascinating thing to me was that every teacher across the board said that daylighting was the single most important thing in their classroom. It was more important than student-teacher ratio. It was more important than classroom size, daylighting, because it has such an effect on the kids, and they see it. They see it viscerally, right? And that was such a surprise in writing the book, and it really transformed my opinion of daylighting and my approach to daylighting. And now, to me, if I would go into an existing building, that'd probably be the number one thing that I would look to change.
Awesome. And now, what are some, is there a different approach? Have you seen, whether it be K through 12 or higher education, or is it all really the same, kind of the same spaces, same approaches, that sort of thing?
No, not at all. K through 12 is its own animal. And we normally design a lot of those spaces to be somewhat bulletproof, especially any spaces where you can't see them all the time. Like the bathrooms in a K through 12 school are designed a lot like prison bathrooms, unfortunately, because you have no idea what the kids are doing in there. The classrooms, the classrooms are also a little different, because basically a teacher will cover every surface of wall with something. So if you had this whole like color palette, material palette thing in mind, that's going to be blown out the window. And so what we really designed towards is everything above 8 feet, because the teachers can't reach that. So, all the materials 8 feet above, we usually make them light to help with the daylighting strategy. There's a clear story, there's a reflective surface, but everything below 8 feet is covered with, cat posters and like whatever they think of. Higher ed's different. Higher ed's, you're designing more like, it's more like an office, really. And those spaces are a little better treated, and they're also differently financed, right? We're not coming from a place of scarcity. We're really coming from a much more long-term view of, building a campus and a campus that they'll invest in. So it's two very, very different client types, and I think a lot of people make the mistake of assuming that they're the same.
Sure. Thank you for clarifying. I think Eric from Safe Traces has joined us. Eric, is that you?
I am, and I am profusely sorry. I could not get on to the Zoom. So anyway, I'm here now, dialed in.
No, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. Eric, we did a little bit introductions, but could you introduce yourself and Safe Traces to our attendees today?
Sure thing. So thanks so much, Jen and the Mortar team, for putting this on, and grateful for the opportunity. So I'm Eric Malmstrom. I'm the CEO of Safe Traces, which is a Bay Area-based safety technology company that does a lot of work on indoor air quality and ventilation and filtration assessments, and much of the built environment, including schools. And so essentially our technology is like an X-ray of a building's ventilation system. We have aerosol tracer particles that simulate respiratory emissions of sick people, and then we use a DNA tag to track where those particles are traveling and help assess the safety of the space, how well the ventilation and filtration systems are performing, and ultimately make those spaces safer and help schools and others kind of target their efforts and spend their money more wisely. So we're super excited about our work in schools, given just the mission and the impact, and are out in a lot of schools testing things. And so that our work intimately interacts with the building design and the mechanical systems. So we see a lot of stuff, and we're out kind of just on the front lines helping people make smarter decisions.
No, awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I know we started really large thinking about, the buildings of the space, the design of the space. Let's move inside and talk a little bit about the products and the services that are needed to create those sustainable education spaces. And I know, Susan, you at GMI, well, you and GMI have done quite a bit of work on kind of those sustainability certifications with your family of products. Could you talk a little bit more about the work that you've done at GMI and that you're seeing in the sustainability space?
Yeah, sure. So we recently level certified a subset of our products, and we really went after that certification specifically because it's end-to-end. There's a lot of sustainable certifications out there, but a lot of those are just single attribute certifications where level is looking holistically at how you are performing as a company and how your manufacturing practices, all the way through to how the product itself is produced, where are the pieces and parts sourced from, and then looking at those things like emissions and all those things that we're very familiar with. I think level is one of those certifications that's just starting to take hold, but in my opinion, and from what the research that I've done around this, really the best certification you can look for when you're sourcing products, because it is looking at end to end, right? Looking at everything that you are doing. And of course, if you can't find something that's level certified, just looking for any sort of certification around any sort of green or sustainable, however we want to define that, is better than not finding it. And of course, if you can't find a product that meets your specs that has one of these certifications, looking local. We're proud also to be a US based manufacturer. That's going to cut down on your carbon emissions too, right? It's just not going to have to travel as far to get to where it's going. And there's a lot that goes into being a US manufacturer that is a lot more sustainable than something overseas.
Definitely. Now, Level is through BIFMA, correct? It's one of their sustainability certification brand or names.
Yeah. So it is BIFMA's level sustainability certification. There are different levels of level that you can achieve. We are level 2 certified. There's 3 levels. So it opens up a lot of doors for us, but also something we really take seriously as a manufacturer too. It is one of our core values, focusing on the environment. And this is just putting a stake in the ground saying, yeah, no, this is truly what we believe as a manufacturer.
Definitely. Eric Corey Freed, since we have 2 Erics on the call now, how do you and your teams at Canon Design kind of pay attention and look for those certifications as you're looking at the spaces that you're designing and building?
Well, there are a lot of them out now, and I almost feel like we have to be agnostic to all of them. A lot of clients will specifically request a certain one, usually LEED, but WELL has been coming up much more. And again, these are multi-attribute standards, so it makes sense that they do them. But I think, a lot of times I think they ask for them because they think they're supposed to. And so one of the things that we do early on is say, well, what is it about LEED Silver that gets you excited? And usually the answer is, well, nothing. We just thought we had to do it. And then so we engage them in a process to really explore what is it you're after. And so, like, for example, recently we had a client, it was a community college. Community colleges are interesting because there's an equity component because they serve a certain demographic that's different than maybe, other schools. And that to me is an opportunity to really start to engage them. And so they came in asking for LEED Silver. They weren't that excited about it. And that really turned into a conversation around, well, what about something like Envision, where we can look at the sustainable infrastructure of the campus, and maybe something like Eco Districts, which has an equity component. And that got them a lot more excited. It got them a lot more engaged. It had a stakeholder engagement piece. So, anytime I see any certification, I kind of think, well, maybe this is a chance to question that. And then when we go on, to the interiors, I really ask them what their larger goals are. And oftentimes I'll start with a provocation and say, what if this was the healthiest building on your campus? What would that mean to you? What would it mean to the students? What would it mean to the staff? What do you think it would look like? What are you worried about when you hear that. And so I play the role of almost a therapist, for lack of a better word, where we're pulling out all this information. And that'll also lead into a lot of certifications. So they might come in asking for, LEED Silver, and after a conversation like that, no, we're going to go for WELL Platinum, and this will be the healthiest building we've ever done. And that's a lot more exciting to them. It's certainly a lot more exciting to me, knowing that we're much closer aligning to their goals. And then we can get into individual finishes and so forth.
No, I think it's, sorry, Susan,
One clarifying point on that too. So everything Eric just talked about are building certifications, right? And products are not LEED certified, but they contribute to the points you need for LEED, right? So I think that's how like both of those things that we just both talked about tie together, and evaluating products that goes into those spaces to achieve whatever the building goals are.
Yeah, and having if I'm getting furniture that's BIFMA level certified, that contributes towards certain credits in LEED or WELL.
Right.
And even if it doesn't, at least I get to have the conversation. So it's not about the certification. It's almost more about what the individual certifications for products represent. And to me, it shows a manufacturer's commitment to these things and a commitment to transparency. And that's much more important to me as an architect than, who's specifying it where and all that other business.
No,
Right.
definitely. I think there's, at the heart of both of those conversations, there's the commitment and the passion to do better, and also that education piece. And so it's not only are the companies, like GMI and Canon Design educating themselves on the process, but then also the clients and the conversations. And Ben, we talked a few weeks ago about just some of the education that you've seen, especially get heightened over the last year and with the pandemic on the product lines that you're overseeing. Could you talk a little bit more about kind of 3M's role in these education spaces as well?
Yeah, so one of the things that we saw last year, so 3M we manufacture disinfectants along with many other products, from a safety perspective. And what we found last year is when COVID really started to, we started hearing about it in January. We started seeing globally in some of our other global areas or regions that this thing called COVID was starting to bubble up, and we all kind of said like, okay, what is it? And that was in January. And by the time March hit, we're in full on, we are in a pandemic now, which many of us have never lived through or ever experienced. And so what we started to see starting last March as we got into April, is a lot of our education customers started to say, what do we do? We're not sure. And we said, okay, well, when you're saying, what do you do? Help us understand, what does that mean? And a lot of them came to us and said, we disinfect, but can we still get disinfectants? How do we disinfect? What's the proper way to disinfect? And what we saw is not only our healthcare customers, but our education customers really started to have to educate the public on how do we disinfect? What can you disinfect? What is the process for disinfection? As we look at, just what we have in our cupboards at home today of taking, whether it's bleach or taking another disinfectant and just spraying it on the surface and wiping it, it was helping educate our education customers so they could help in turn educate their families, their students on, okay, nope, you actually got to let it sit on that surface for a minute or 3 minutes in order for it to kill what's actually on that surface. And so what we started to see over the past 18 months is a lot of our education customers, they said, our goal right now is to get to the finish line being the end of the school year. They said, we're really focused on get us to the end. And they, and I look at my own children in the school district there, and they said, just bear with us. We know this is going to be tough. Just please hang in there with us, which was really difficult, obviously, for them. But what we started to see is they said, we get us there. And then as 3M started talking to our education customers after the school year broke, and, they got a couple of weeks of, okay, let's take a breath and let's see where we are now. A lot of them came back and said, we want to look at how do we start disinfecting sustainably? How do we clean sustainably? And how do we take those messages out to our stakeholders, our families, our communities, and explain to them, this is our process, this is our protocol, this is what we're doing. Here's how you can help be safe at home. So when your student comes to the school, whether it be K-12 or higher ed, this is what safety looks like for us now. So we started to really see a paradigm shift over the last, 12 to 18 months of our customers saying, we've got these great surfaces. Our architects have designed, these great facilities. They're sustainable. How do we, one, keep them safe, and how do we not ruin them? So it really started to change from what, we just normally clean to this is our process and how do we do it effectively on a routine basis.
Mm-hmm. How have you, so obviously you've managed through that shift, and are there different components that you're putting into place, like kind of forward thinking, future thinking with products, with those conversations? How is that looking on your end now?
Yeah, so we're now that we're out of kind of the, after the last 18 months of just, all right, we're managing it, we're hopefully coming out of it, and we'll see, what the fall looks like. And, one of the things that a lot of our education customers have said to us is they've anecdotally in different, parts of the country have said, we're not entirely sure we're going to make it through the school year without going back to some form of distance or remote learning. We see that as plan on it. And so what we, look at from their perspective is helping them understand, how do we as a manufacturer support them? What do their plans look like? What are their needs? If they hit that button and they say, okay, we're going remote, how do they plan to start cleaning and disinfecting the school for when students come back? So when when you shut down a building, it's shut down from that point in time, but that's when all the heavy duty work starts from a cleaning and disinfection perspective of every desk surface, every surface, and the ones, things that are wood typically are a little bit more porous. So how do we clean those? How do we clean different vinyl surfaces, things like that? So we're kind of in that process with them of understanding, similar to what Susan said and what Eric said, understanding, playing that, kind of that mentor role, or kind of helping them guide them through, okay, when you shut down, what is your process? What type of, inventory do you need, and what type of surfaces? And then how do we help you through that process?
Definitely. Let's shift a little bit. Eric Malmstrom, could you talk a little bit about the role that Safe Traces plays in some of these conversations as you're looking at kind of current spaces or new and even new spaces as well?
Absolutely. So the role that we play, I think that the pandemic experience has put the spotlight on indoor air quality and the role that kind of building design and mechanical systems and operations play in indoor air quality. And then importantly, how indoor air quality can create risk of disease transmission, as we're seeing with COVID, but even outside of COVID, there's seasonal flu, there's other airborne diseases that every year we're having to deal with, and that are large, to a large extent, the kind of indoor environments that we live and work in and go to school in are responsible for kind of helping spread those viruses. And so from there, you kind of go to, well, how do we help get this under control, not only for the current COVID pandemic world we live in, but for the future, and not only for diseases, but also for all the other reasons that you want to have good air quality. And there are a lot of studies that, well-known studies that show how indoor air quality improves cognition and performance amongst students and employees and people in indoor spaces. And so I think that the pandemic, while it's been obviously a really terrible experience in terms of the human and health costs and the financial costs, it's helping focus in on this important piece of health and the building's role in health. And now I think that we see a lot more interest and a lot more momentum on kind of quote healthy buildings, and even defining what that is and the role of air. So Safe Traces comes into this as someone who's just trying to provide real world performance data on what would a building, an optimal HVAC system or building design look like as you're putting it through the lens of keeping people healthy, safe, and performing at their best. Buildings have traditionally not been designed, I'd say, with that being a prominent focus. And, I'll defer to the architects and others on this panel who can speak to that. But, it's something that is not front and center. I think now you're going to see that change a bit, and there's going to be a longer tail from the pandemic. It's not just going to be like one day everyone's vaccinated, we get this under control, and we're back to normal. I think you're going to see health and safety be much more prominent in kind of building design and operations. And where we come in is we have a tool that's independent, that's science-based, and that allows you to understand, not at the level of a computational fluid dynamic model or running calculations, but actually getting into a real world space and testing what happens if we design the building this way or that way, or we put the ventilation system in this way or that way, or run it at different setting levels. And so, we just are a tool to help people make better decisions, design things better with this focus on health and safety. And then I'd say the second order effect is that health and safety has a huge impact on sustainability of the building and the carbon footprint, the energy penalties and cost penalties associated with different ventilation practices, obviously, which are important from a sustainability standpoint, but they're also hitting the cost structure of the building. And, you need to balance ventilation and all these other things that keep people healthy and safe, but often have big price tags associated with them. And you need to counterbalance that against doing this in a financially sustainable way and in a way where you're not emitting a lot more carbon and using a lot more energy. And so Safe Traces is kind of a tool to help people figure out what's the midpoint between those two sets of concerns, or this whole concept of resilience. At certain points, you're going to want to dial up the health and safety kind of ventilation if you're in the pandemic. But then when we're out of that, you're going to want to run the building differently. And so we help guide people on kind of those different parameters, and it's very complicated. And so having real world data can help make a lot better decisions. And that's where we come in, at the level of schools and office buildings and elsewhere, prisons, mass transit. The whole built environment is having to grapple with this right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Eric, Corey, Frieda, I'd love some thoughts and comments from you on the shift that you're seeing within, not just the education sector, but that shift in how buildings are being designed and maybe even repurposed now.
Oh gosh. We've been, living through a pandemic is weird because you're essentially a real-time lab experiment, and you're learning as you're going. It's been kind of interesting to me because on the one hand, when the pandemic first started, we assumed that all of our school clients would just double the size of all their spaces for social distancing, which we didn't want. It just seemed like a waste, and that hasn't really been the case. Instead, it's been much more about cleaning protocols, operations, and ventilation more than anything. And those things can really are really all you need. Ventilation especially, but they've got great cleaning protocols in place. They were able to institute them right away. It's much easier to change operational protocols than it is to change walls. And so the architecture didn't change as much as we thought it would. The mechanical systems did. And just like the other Eric said, we are doing CFD analysis now to look at how air flows through a space, and we can model it and predict it just as much as we can model and predict energy use. We just haven't been before because we never really thought we needed to. My daughter is she's in the 8th grade. She goes to school in this really old building. It doesn't have a central air heating system. It's got radiators and windows. So we modeled the space, and it turns out it's actually pretty good. You open the windows, the radiators keep them warm. It's not very energy efficient, but it works as a COVID stopgap, I guess, for this year. And they're still wearing masks, of course. So all that's great. But I think it showed us kind of human beings as a tendency, we tend to only focus on the most pressing issues. So right now it's ventilation and cleaning. There'll be some other catastrophe that we'll deal with, and then we'll suddenly forget everything that we learned about ventilation and cleaning. Hopefully not, but we will. And then we tend to only focus on one panic emergency at a time, and maybe it's the way our little monkey brains are wired, but who knows.
Mm-hmm. How do you keep those important topics and important conversations front and center, from project to project, and whether, Susan, on your end, from product development, and how do you, it would be interesting to get your thoughts on all of this. Like, how do you keep the need for sustainability, the need for those certifications and practices? How do you keep that front and center across product lines, across projects? I think, even Ben, on your end, and some of those conversations that you're having, how do you keep those all front and center?
Who are you asking?
All of you. So Susan, let's start with you on the product side.
Sure. So, like I said, it's one of our founding principles. It's printed everywhere. So sustainability and care for our environment is something that we have been doing since our founding, 45 years ago. So it's not a new concept to us, and it is something that's just part of who we are. Now, with that being said, I think there are a lot more requirements around indoor air quality, and maybe it is the hot topic for right now. So it is something that we pay super close attention to, but it's not something that we haven't paid attention to in the past. And a lot of things that we're doing as a manufacturer, so some of them are really big, like getting our products level certified. We're currently evaluating some bio-based paint for our glass boards, like this glass board behind me. A lot of glass boards like this are produced with epoxy paints, which are not great for the indoor air quality, right? But something that is more bio-based has and performs the same is a better solution. So, we're evaluating some bigger things like that, but even the small things that we can do as a manufacturer. I was just out on the floor looking at some boards for Neocon, and we were talking about the switch we made from just something simple like using plastic cups for our paint machine to paper cups, because they're much more biodegradable, right? And recyclable and different things like that. So we look at everything we're doing from end to end when we're making decisions, and it just really is ingrained in our product development process.
Yeah, and one thing I was going to say, so from the 3M side of it, one of the things that we do is every new product that we come out with across any of our global businesses, it has to have some sustainability elements to it, whether it helps save water, helps save energy, et cetera, et cetera. But, I think, the question I think, Jen, that you asked, how do you start planning for it? How do you have some of those conversations? When we're talking to our customers, one of the things that we kind of ask them is, what is your process? So when when we look at our education facilities over the last year that have gone through transformation, when they're looking at building something new or renovating or doing something different, kind of ask them, okay, how are you making this sustainable? How are you changing this? And how do you, when you're selecting things to go into those spaces, how do you make sure, one, that they're sustainable? And then we look at how do you make sure that you're able to operationally keep them sustainable? We look at sustainability as, there are the core elements of what is, makes a product or something sustainable, but we also look at how do you keep a business operation? How do you keep a process sustainable? How do you make sure that you're not spending more time and resource on things than you absolutely have to, or how do you help reduce time and effort? So we kind of look at, we look at the sustainability side of things as not just the feature, but how is it operationally from schools in the K-12 arena aren't, for the most part, businesses, but when you look at universities and get into higher ed, they become businesses. So how do you make sure that the business itself is sustainable as well?
No, definitely. Eric, that reminds me of a conversation that you and I had for a couple of weeks ago for the forum article, and you had mentioned the money-saving practices that a lot of this work can cause as well. Could you talk a little bit about that with some of these projects?
Me, Eric, or the other?
Yes, you, Eric Corey Fried.
So we've been taking a circular economy framework approach to clients, and then also consulting to manufacturers about this. And it's really kind of amazing, because it seems like almost every company has done the low-hanging fruit piece. What are the obvious efficiencies they can do? Now we're getting into the real weeds of it. I mean, like Susan said, just looking at the cups that they use for the paint, it's not very sexy, but those things have a huge impact and add up. And that's where for a sustainability nerd like me, that's where the real juice is, right? So those are the levels of conversations that we're having with manufacturers, looking at it from a true end to end. And the thing about going through a circular economy process is that it's not about just efficiencies of doing this better or tighter or whatever, but really stepping back and questioning the whole process and trying to, I lead companies through an exercise where we have them design out waste. How would you redesign your supply chain? How would you redesign your assembly line? How would you redesign your processes if you could just start from scratch? And what would that look like? And then we build it back together. So it gives them an opportunity to kind of wave their magic wand and start over. And in designing out waste, you suddenly find other opportunities that also lead to new products. I just did this with a I probably can't say the name of the company, but I just did this with a manufacturer in Detroit. Let's say that much. And went through their plant, went through all the assembly processes, and asked very basic questions of, well, how do you do that, and what does it do that? And I as just having the benefit of just being an innocent moron like me who's coming in, just I asked these very childlike questions, but it led to all these breakthroughs in their product line. And what we ended up with was they were going to essentially not just find these efficiencies in how they make their products, but we mapped out a whole new line of products they could make that would be their eco line. But we decided not even to call it that because it was so much more than that. It had like new aesthetic benefits and new values, and it would be done at half the embodied carbon and half the natural gas usage. And so suddenly it's giving yourself permission to ask those questions and just redesign your system is a bit of a gift.
Definitely. Susan, did I cut you off when initially?
Oh, yeah. Tangent off of something that Ben said, not related at all to what Eric just said, but as I was preparing for today and what I wanted to say, I was talking to my husband, who happens to be a high school teacher, and I was like, what does sustainability mean to you in your classroom? And the first thing out of his mouth was around warranties and making sure that the product is going to last. And I found that twist really interesting, because we've been sitting here talking about green and certifications and all these things that really are at the heart of it, right? But he's a teacher and he just wants something that's going to last. Eric said it's got to be a prison bathroom. Well, like everything in a classroom has to be stand up to those rigors, to those students, because who knows what they're going to do with that. And so I think that's another thing just to keep in mind when looking for something that is sustainable. You don't want to have to continually replace something. So this eco line, maybe it is really great and does all those things, but if you have to replace it in a year or two, what are we really doing here, right? So I think it's a balance of all those things.
There's a it's funny because if we just let the number of people choose everything, we go through this in every classroom. They say things like, we want whiteboards. And so we don't pick out whiteboards, we pick out glass boards because they're prettier. So like we'll use the Ghent, we'll specify the Ghent glass boards. And then at some point, and everybody loves them and they love the way they look. And then at some point later, like right at the end, they go through a value engineering process, and they want to get rid of them. And what I found is, if I make an argument about how glass is non-porous and it's healthier and all that, nobody gives a crap. But if I just show them, okay, here's a very pretty glass board, and here's a melamine toxic whiteboard, and I just show them side by side, the best thing I can do is just let them see how ugly the whiteboard is. And that convinces them to keep them. And all my other logical arguments about health and air quality, they go out the window.
Yeah. So one thing I was so excited about for this conversation was you all impact these spaces in different ways, but you all play together and rely on each other to do what you're doing. How does the end user, I mean, like Susan, you mentioned your husband, the high school teacher, but how does the facilities director help guide some of these conversations? So, if it is a question of how things look or how long things will last, how can those end users, like the facilities directors that are helping kind of maybe guide and start the process of a remodel or a retrofit, or maybe embarking on a new build, like how does that person kind of partner with you all on that effort? And I'm happy to have anyone jump in and start that open-ended question.
We do it.
Sorry.
Go ahead. We use a very formal process, and we even talk about it at the beginning, called life cycle costing. But we have a little spin on it where we call it LCCA plus, and it's just a fancy branding thing. But really, what it is let's say I'm looking at a new floor. It's not just the upfront cost of buying the material. It's not just the cost of installing that floor, but what's it going to cost to clean and maintain it and ultimately replace it. And so we do a full life cycle costing analysis of that. But then if that floor also contributes to biophilic principles and boosts the outcome of that, we factor that into the life cycle cost. If that floor also has a reflectance or an albedo that's going to help with the daylighting scheme, we factor that into it as well. If that floor has any sort of thermal mass, and helps regulate the temperature in the classroom, we factor that in as well. So we're not just going after the financial out-of-pocket expenses, but all the indirect financial benefits that it has too. That's the plus in LCCA plus. And at least that way they can make an informed decision. That's a much better stance for a client, right? If after I give them all that information, they still choose the cheapest, ugliest thing that they're gonna have to replace in 5 years, that's on them. But I'd like to think that if I've done my job correctly and given them all the information, then at least they're coming from a place of sanity.
Yeah, and from a manufacturer perspective, for us, you know, once we have what the specs are, what the design is, working with a dealer or an architect, you know, we really have options for people. So yes, we have these gorgeous, beautiful glass doors like what's behind me. But also we know that financially it doesn't always make sense for people, right? So that's where I think looking at the warranties and where a product is made can also contribute to some of those requirements or wants in a building. Because we don't have melamine because, like you said, it's not eco-friendly, but we do have a non-magnetic whiteboard if that truly is what fits the budget, and it's made here in the US, right? But we have all of the options for whatever visual communication surface that someone might need, and we're going to get it to you quickly when you need it, because we know boards are always the last thing that goes on a wall too. So as part of that design.
Yeah. I think one of
I'll
the,
just say,
oh, go ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Amy.
No, go for it.
Okay, what I was just going to quickly say is on the facility side of things. So when we're working with the facility directors, we're working with them usually a lot of the times after the building's already intact, and they're saying, okay, this is what I've got now. Help me do the best of it. Help me do the best that you can now that everything's up and we're off and running. And so what we really focus on is trying as much as we can to say, make sure you're sitting at that table up front. So if, you know, as we're looking across, school districts or large campuses, saying, you know, you might not have been at the table for this conversation for this building, but make sure you're at the next one, because, you know, when you look at how buildings are cleaned, how they're disinfected, how they're managed and cared for, and like Eric talked about, you know, when you look at the floors, how the floors are maintained, you know, there's right now, it's tough to find employees to do a lot of these types of jobs. And so, you know, when you look at a typical K-12 building, the entire thing is not cleaned and disinfected on a daily basis. The entire building itself is not disinfected. Usually it's broken into pods. You know, pod 1 is this wing of the building or this section of the building, and we'll get to that every 4 days. And so, you know, we got to make sure that, you know, we kind of look at and try to encourage that conversation from a facility side of make sure you're at that table, because when when you're talking about the size, the space, what, you know, materials are going in, we need to make sure that you can clean it and disinfect it quickly and move on, you know. And if there's a surface where if you're disinfecting it or you're applying a disinfectant to it and it starts to streak, you now spend more time going back after you've disinfected it and wiping it down again. So we always try to encourage, be at that table with your experience, or, you know, the experience of previous buildings, of know what you're getting into, know what those decisions are, because at the end of the day, once the walls are up, it's on you to make sure that it looks good for not only the students, but, you know, as the community comes into your buildings. You know, a lot of schools are community hubs.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think that on our side, it's been interesting, back to one of my previous points, you know, at the facilities director level, and as it relates to the air piece of things and the mechanical systems, I think that historically they haven't really thought about those systems and their role in health and safety as that they are now. It's been kind of a thought process evolution of, you know, traditionally, to the extent that HVAC and mechanical systems were coming up, someone's complaining about, you know, a room being too hot or too cold, or something's broken. And now people understand that those systems are actually playing a much more significant role in just the general health and safety environment in the building. And so I think for us, we found that in some cases, some facility directors are really getting it and are wanting to get ahead of things. In other cases, they're being kind of responsive to just an overwhelming situation and kind of, you know, warning on the fly. And in other cases, I think there's just a lot of skepticism of, you know, not thinking that those systems do have the health and safety impacts that they do, or, you know, needing to see more evidence. And I think generally a lot of, not so much in schools, but in other environments, facilities are looking for ROI, or return on investment, on certain interventions. So it's either going to reduce their costs, or it's going to help, increase revenue in a building, or however defined. So I think that, there's a lot of work to be done to kind of draw clear linkages between health and safety. And in the school, I think, what resonates with facility directors and others in schools on our side is ultimately schools are trying to keep teachers and students in classrooms, and their funding is connected to that. The school's performance is assessed on that to some degree. And if you, then look at that and say, well, ultimately we need to have a safer environment for people to come into. And if people are getting sick and we're having to have lots of students and teachers be absent or shut down the school, that's really going to start compromising, their funding, and then more importantly, the actual educational outcomes of students in those schools. And so, it's a little bit of a thought process evolution within the facilities world, but I think people are starting to see that and appreciate that more and more.
Definitely. Eric Malmstrom, how does Safe Traces help kind of support those conversations and opportunities?
Yeah, so I think that we do so in a few ways. So right now, especially in the lead up to the school year starting again for much of the country within the past couple of weeks, there was a lot of kind of work and planning and coordinations going on over the summer in school districts across the country on what is going to be our plan to bring people back. What are we going to do? How are we going to keep people back in here safely? There are lots of concerns coming out of last year's experience and how disrupted it was. And then also, some pretty incredible, not only like the actual health and safety challenges, but also the politics regarding masking, vaccination, the dynamics between teachers and teachers unions and parents and administrators. And it's really challenging. So, that's number one. Number two, then it's like, what are we actually going to do? How are we going to reopen this school in a way that we feel confident that it's safe? We can communicate that to our community. And then when students and teachers and staff come back in, that we're not shutting ourselves down right off the bat. And I think, we're seeing this play out in real time right now, what's happening in schools. And there's a lot of uncertainty of, is it going to be fine, or are kids going to get more infected, and teachers and so forth? And it's been a very mixed experience across the country right now. Where Safe Traces comes in is basically, helping provide performance data on this critical piece of the puzzle. So masking and vaccination, critically important for sure. But there's this third kind of piece of the puzzle, which is, the air quality, and then relatedly kind of disinfection and cleaning of how you keep that space safe. And I feel like for every article and thing I hear in the public discourse about masking and vaccination, like ventilation and building safety is like the redheaded stepchild, where there's orders of magnitude less talked about that. Well, it may be equally, if not more important than those other things. And so you have to get people to understand this needs to be part of your plan. And then you need to actually figure out where you're at right now. Is your building, is it performing to a certain level? Like even having a common language regarding terms like safety, health, and sustainability, that's not out there, not clear standards and regulations right now. The information environment is overwhelming in terms of all the twists and turns of the pandemic. And Safe Traces comes in as an independent assessor along with partners to help a school think through, what are we going to do in our building? Where's it at right now in terms of the overall health and safety? And then baseline that by doing assessments in a school, taking that data, looking at it, seeing, okay, maybe the school is more in a better place than we thought, or maybe it's not, or it's a mixed story. And then using that data to ultimately then, to have targeted interventions in the building that are actually going to help make it healthier and safer. And then also do that in a financially sustainable and cost efficient way, and then in an environmentally sustainable way too. So all we're trying to do is provide real world data that's independent, science-based, to then help decision makers kind of manage their way through the challenges right now. And it's been great. People are looking for that information. You know, in many cases, they want help. You know, they want data. They just don't have good ways of getting it. And so that's where we come into this whole equation.
Definitely. And I think, you know, and it's, you know, not just COVID, but, you know, our world it will never look the same once we move out of this. And so it's helping set that baseline, and then also educating and providing the information so that, you know, the best decisions can be made at the time. Susan, how are, you know, as we kind of look to wrap up the conversation, how is GMI companies and its family of brands really preparing for that future, for the, you know, for the coming years, and some of that work that you're doing?
We are really, you know, I mentioned I talked to my husband, my mini focus group of one before this, but we do that much broader as a company too, and really are out there talking to end users, to our dealers, to architects, to designers. So we really have a pulse, because being a manufacturer in this commercial world, we're very far from those end users for the most part, unless you live with them, right? So you know, getting in front of people to really learn and keep a pulse on everything that's going on. You know, to use the most overused word of 2020, we really did pivot in 2020 to look at our pieces and parts of our products in different ways to be able to help with some of these challenges very quickly. And because we are based here in Cincinnati, we are able to really deliver really quickly to people. You know, we're hearing over and over again the need for configurability, but the real need for communication, for collaboration, even when you are wearing a mask or having to sit behind a plexi divider or have to be 6 feet apart. And so a lot of our products, we're really looking at them and seeing how can they be multifunctional, how can they be used in different ways, and but still help with communication, collaboration, and learning.
Definitely. And Ben, on your end with 3M and the work that you're doing, what are some of those conversations like now as we kind of look forward into what the coming years will be?
Yeah, so I think very similar to what Susan said. It's kind of taking that, trying to get as close as we can to our customer to understand now that we're coming through, the world has changed, and you know it you know, as we're coming out of COVID, you know, we're now just in the immediate future looking at flu season starting, and so okay, now that you know, hopefully that, you know, and I shouldn't say coming out of COVID, but as COVID hopefully starts to ramp down, looking at things like flu season, looking at how do we start trying to figure out what are the ways that we can start getting ahead of the curve with our customers? What are the things that, you know, 18 months ago weren't a priority that are a priority now? So continuing to have that pulse, understand where are you going, and really how do we help you do it quicker and more effectively than what you're doing it today? So it's really more of a conversation of helping our customers understand this is where we see those macro trends, and then having them come back to us with, here's how our facility has changed and what it's doing differently as we go forward.
Definitely. Thank you. Eric Corey Fried, what are you seeing on your end with some of the conversations that you're having in the education space and related to sustainability?
There's been, you know, in a certain sense, the indoor air quality conversation shifted from formaldehyde and VOCs to ventilation for infection control reasons. I'm assuming that that'll go away, and hopefully some of those infection control lessons we learned will become just best practices and, you know, feed into our body of knowledge. But the interesting thing that we haven't mentioned yet, I just want to mention, is that it's led to this conversation around outdoor spaces, and redesigning the landscape and the hardscape around the building for flexibility. So we're doing a student health center at University of Florida. Florida is, you know, at times can be hot and humid and uncomfortable to be outside, but instead of just increasing the size of the building, which seemed like a waste, we instead redesigned the bit of the landscape in the middle of this pandemic to really look at how, if they needed to, they can now suddenly pop up tents very easily, and we put in additional infrastructure so they could hold classes or stages or performances or whatever. And so it just led to this kind of fun conversation. I think we've all seen this anecdotally in our cities, I live in Portland, Oregon, and a lot of streets have now been closed off to cars and turned over to the pedestrians, and the restaurants have all collectively built their outdoor spaces, and it's created these mini parklets all over the city. And now we're demanding that they keep them right forever, which is great. So we've had this kind of pop-up urbanism thing happening as well. And so I'm really trying to look at the bright side of the last 2 years and how awful it's been. And those are the things that kind of are fascinating to me, right? This idea, you know, Susan mentioned collaboration. We're now seeing clients come in with a much more sophisticated level of discussion around how they want to collaborate. They have models of collaboration they use. We're doing a project for a confidential client now, and we're designing for what they call the Pixar effect, like that idea that in the hallways, bumping into somebody in the hallways could lead to an idea. What Steve Jobs designed the Pixar headquarters around, we're doing for clients because they're coming and asking for that kind of serendipity to happen. And so that's been fun. And so do we make every surface a whiteboard? I'm sure Susan would like that, but I need to have windows somewhere, and and other things. But it it raises this kind of like great idea, like how do you design for collaboration in a healthy, meaningful, interesting, aesthetically beautiful, affordable way? And it's led to some kind of fun solutions.
No, definitely. Well, I want to thank you all so much for joining me today. It was a very broad conversation. And so I know we've had a question come in the Q&A about how attendees can follow up with panelists, and we will be sharing contact information as well as a recording of today's conversation with all that have registered. So stay tuned to your inboxes for that information. But thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate the conversation and you all taking the time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. Have a good day.
Bye.